I remember walking into Grandma's foyer and feeling it all over again, the familiar hum of tension that thrummed through the room whenever Dad was within earshot. The scent of roasting turkey and pumpkin pie mingled with the sharp tang of over-polished hardwood floors. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I was certain Dad would hear it and use it against me. It was Thanksgiving, my most dreaded day of the year, precisely because Dad had perfected his annual performance of disappointment. He greeted me with that clipped nod, the one that said, "You're still here, still nothing. Haven't changed, haven't grown up." The family chatter swirled around us, Mom fussing over the yams, Uncle Joe asking about my job yet again, Aunt Caroline pressing me for relationship updates. Everyone offered the usual, "How's work? What's new?" All code for "prove to me you're not a screw-up." And under it all, Dad's eyes bored into me like X-rays, searching for every flaw, every hesitation, every sign that I hadn't become the person he wanted me to be. "Nice to see you made it," he said, loud enough for a couple of relatives to glance our way. His voice was polite, but the edge was clear, like a blade hidden beneath a velvet glove. I forced a smile, pushing my shoulders back, reminding myself that I was 27, a college graduate, employed, and living in my own apartment. But none of that seemed to matter. To him, I was still the kid who'd flunked out of 2 internships, the one who dropped out of art school to chase some whimsical dream, the kid who hadn't earned his place at the table. I made my way through the living room, hugged Grandma, exchanged awkward pleasantries with my siblings, and joined the end of the buffet line. The mashed potatoes were rich and buttery, the stuffing perfectly golden. I heaped my plate, determined to eat something, anything, before the inevitable interrogation began. I swallowed a forkful of green beans and tried to find the silver lining. At least Grandma's cooking hadn't suffered from Dad's disapproval. "Tom, why don't you grab a seat next to me?" Dad called, patting the chair beside him at the head of the table. I swallowed another mouthful, set my fork down, and moved to sit. The chair slipped out awkwardly, the legs scraping the floor in a screech that felt like nails down a chalkboard to my ears, and to Dad's expression. He didn't smile, but something in his tight lips suggested satisfaction that I dared not take for granted. The first few minutes were deceptively pleasant. Small talk about the weather, Dad's golf game, Mom's new garden. I found myself relaxing, even enjoying a rare moment of peace. Then he leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "So," he said, voice low enough that only I could hear it, "I've been hearing some things about you not doing so well at work. Is that true?" I felt every eye shift toward us. My chest tightened. I took a breath, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Actually, Dad, work's been going really well. I've taken on some new responsibilities." He let out a slow exhale, like he'd been waiting to puncture my pride. "Responsibilities? What kind?" "Really important ones," I said, trying to summon confidence. "I've been managing a small team for 6 months now. Our project delivered ahead of schedule." He clicked his tongue. "You? Managing people? I thought you were still figuring out what you wanted to do with your life." The room grew cold. Aunt Caroline glanced at me with sympathy. Uncle Joe cleared his throat. Mom's face registered a mixture of anger and shame. Anger at Dad, shame that this was happening again. Grandma looked poised to intervene, but held back, perhaps habituated by years of similar Thanksgiving showdowns. Behind Dad's words, I heard the old refrain: failure, loser, disappointment. The soundtrack of my childhood, replaying like a broken record needle dragging across vinyl. "I'm serious," I said more firmly, lifting my chin. "I've been good at this. I'm actually proud of what I've accomplished." He leaned back, shaking his head slowly. "Proud," he repeated, incredulous. "You should be ashamed of yourself. You're barely keeping the lights on, living in that dingy apartment you can't even decorate properly, sucking up resources from us. That doesn't sound like success." My fork clattered against my plate. I could feel my cheeks burning, but underneath that boiling anger was a flicker of something else, an idea so deliciously audacious that I almost laughed out loud in front of everyone. To shock Dad at his own dinner table. To prove once and for all that he had no idea who I really was. I met his gaze, and for a moment I saw surprise flicker in his eyes, as if he'd noticed me for the first time in years. "Actually, Dad," I said, voice calm and quiet, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you." The hush around the table was palpable. I watched Mom's hand stutter toward her napkin. Aunt Caroline leaned forward. Even Grandma held her breath. I cleared my throat. "You remember when I left art school? When I moved out on my own? When I told you I was going to make something of myself, even if you didn't believe in me?" He opened his mouth to interrupt, but I held up a hand. "I know what you think, that I'm a waste of space, that I don't deserve to be part of this family business. I let my words hang in the air. That was the real shocker. Our family business. Dad's legacy, his life's work. The one thing he'd always prided himself on more than his children, his vacations, even his own health. The sprawling construction firm that bore his name, built from nothing in the early 1980s, that had grown into a regional giant under his watchful eye. The table grew silent. I could hear the clink of silverware in the distance, the hum of the air conditioner. Then I leaned in, resting my forearms on the polished wood. "Well," I said, then paused, savoring the weight of the moment. Everyone leaned in too, curious, confused. Dad's expression morphed from contempt to mild intrigue. His brows arched just the slightest bit. I took a breath. I own it now. The words rippled through the room like a pebble cast into a still pond. Aunt Caroline's fork slipped from her hand. Uncle Joe's jaw dropped. Mom's eyes widened, mouth opening, then closing again, as if she couldn't believe what had just come out of my mouth. Grandma's face lit up, as though she'd been waiting for exactly this moment all her life. And Dad, oh Dad, his expression cracked, a tiny fissure splitting the facade of control he'd worn all these years. "You, what?" His voice was hoarse, a whisper of his usual thunder. He looked at me, then at Mom, then back at me, as if he might wake up from some bad dream at any second. I let a slow smile spread across my face. "I bought you out," I said quietly, "back in September, with a group of investors who saw the potential you refused to see in me." He looked down, jaw working, then back up, eyes sharp now, scanning my face as though seeking some sign of deceit. "You bought me out," he repeated. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement of disbelief. My chest swelled with a strange mix of triumph and relief. For years I'd carried the weight of his disappointment, the sting of his words, the shame that settled in my bones every time I looked at that big, empty seat at the head of the table. And now, tonight, he was the one who felt small. I watched him blink, as if waking up. And as the swirling mix of shock, anger, and maybe even begrudging admiration flickered across his face, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Everyone's eyes were on me, but all I could see was him. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to deny it, to say I was lying, to reclaim his title as the one in charge. The table leaned forward, waiting. My heart thudded, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel the old familiar fear. I felt something new, power. Not the cruel power of a father over his child, but the quiet, undeniable power of someone who had clawed their way up, who had fought the doubts of everyone around them and had won. Dad's mouth opened, and the first syllable trembled on his lips. But just as he began, the front door creaked, and a cold draft swept in. The room held its collective breath as the polished veneer of our family's history shimmered and cracked, and all the secrets we'd kept, mine, his, ours, rose to the surface, waiting to be named. And in that moment, as the last echoes of his stunned whisper faded, I realized that tonight wasn't just any Thanksgiving. It was the one that changed everything. I caught Dad's eye as he stood there frozen, mouth slightly agape. The door swung shut behind my sister, Emily, late as usual, her cheeks flushed and her purse dangling from one shoulder. She froze at the threshold, reading the tension in the room like a temperature gauge. My mom huffed, rising from her seat to shepherd Emily toward a place at the table, but her eyes never left my father. The air felt electric, crackling with the energy of everything unsaid in our family's history. Dad's shoulders straightened, his expression hardening into the familiar armor he wore for every board meeting and handshake deal he'd ever orchestrated. Yet there was something new, a flicker of vulnerability in his steel-gray eyes. He cleared his throat, the sound heavy in the sudden quiet. "Well," he managed, voice low, "you bought me out, impressive." He paused, and something in his stance softened, a droplet of pride, maybe seeping through the cracks of his ego. "Congratulations," he added, though the words tasted bitter on his tongue. I could feel the tension easing at the table as our relatives exchanged glances. Grandma dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her lips quivering into what looked unmistakably like a proud smile. Aunt Caroline leaned forward, her face alight with curiosity, while Uncle Joe let out a long, slow whistle. Mom perched on the edge of her seat, her eyes moist, her lips twitching between excitement and apprehension. It was as if she'd been waiting for this moment her whole life. I drew in a breath and spoke again. Softer this time. "It wasn't easy. I had to convince people that I could do this, that I was worth the risk. You know how investors are. They're ruthless. They don't care about family dynamics. They care about numbers, projections, market share. I looked around at all of them, my voice steady. They saw potential for change, for growth, for new ideas. They saw what you couldn't, that the company needed fresh blood, new energy, that it was stagnating. Dad folded his arms, jaw clenched. So you think you can do better than me? His question wasn't angry. It was wounded. It stung me to the core that he sounded more hurt than angry. I'm not saying I'm better, I said. I'm saying I'm different. I grew up watching you build this from scratch. I learned from your successes and your failures. I've got my own vision, a way to blend your old school grit with modern innovation. I leaned forward, the wooden table warm beneath my palms. And it starts with people, our employees, our partners, our community. We can't just keep doing the same thing we've always done and expect the same, or better, results. Silence stretched. Then Dad shook his head and gave a short, humorless laugh. You were always the dreamer, he said, but there was a trace of fondness there I hadn't heard in years. The kid with his head in the clouds. He turned to Mom. Do you remember when he used to sketch battle scenes in the margins of his notebooks instead of taking notes? Mom chuckled, wiping a tear from her cheek. He built entire worlds in those margins. Dragons, kingdoms, wars, you name it. I think you discouraged him too much, Harold. She gave Dad a sideways glance. Maybe that's why he left art school. You might have broken his brush, but he didn't lose his creativity. I swallowed, feeling a swell of gratitude for Mom's intervention. Dad looked at me, the stern lines of his face softening. So maybe, he said, glancing at the head of the table, I did push you too hard, expecting you to follow my path. He sighed, the sound hollow. I built this company so you'd have a life better than mine, and instead I ended up, well, ignoring what made you you. I reached across the table and placed my hand on his. The gesture felt surreal, as though I were holding the hand of a stranger, and yet the closest person in my life. I know you did it out of love, I said, but I needed you to see me, not just see a version of yourself. My voice cracked on the last word, and Dad's brow furrowed, the first glimmer of tears in his eyes. Emily slid into her seat, next to Mom, her eyes bright. Tom, she whispered, that's amazing. I can't believe you did all this and never said anything. Her excitement rippled through the table, loosening shoulders and brightening faces. Grandma exclaimed, well, I always knew you were meant for great things, dear. And suddenly the buffet line was forgotten, the turkey and stuffing a distant thought. Dad squeezed my hand, a silent apology and acceptance mingled in his grip. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. You've got a board meeting first thing Monday, he said, voice sturdy, reasserting the old rhythms of business. I expect to see your proposals, your forecasts, your marketing plans. Don't disappoint me again. I laughed, soft, genuine, free of fear. I wouldn't dream of it. The rest of dinner unfolded in a new key. Discussions of cash flow projections, digital strategies, and community outreach replaced the usual passive-aggressive interrogations. Dad asked intelligent questions, provocative ones about remote work policies and sustainability initiatives. I laid out my ideas, establishing an apprenticeship program in local high schools, partnering with green building suppliers, implementing flexible work schedules. Each time I spoke, Dad nodded, asked for numbers, pushed back on costs, and I welcomed it. Between bites of sweet potato casserole and cranberry sauce, I realized this was the most vivid Thanksgiving I'd ever experienced. Not because of the food, though Grandma's pies were divine, but because the meal had become a crossroads. I wasn't just another family member begging for validation. I was a partner. I was someone with authority, vision, and a chance to reshape the legacy of our name. Later, as we gathered around the living room for coffee and conversation, Dad and I sat side by side on the couch, the board meeting agenda printed out and fanned across our laps. He glided through each item, pointing out potential pitfalls and strengths. Then he paused, looked at me, and said, you know, I have a lot to learn from you. I blinked, caught off guard. You do. He chuckled. A sound warmer than any I'd heard from him in years. Yes. This new generation knows things I never even imagined. Social media, remote teams, blockchain, words I still don't fully understand. He tapped the agenda. I built this company with bricks and sweat. You're taking it into cyberspace. Let's see what happens. I felt my chest tighten. A rush of emotion so powerful I could barely speak. I'd be honored, I managed. We'll be a team, Dad. He nodded. And for that instant, he didn't look like the unyielding patriarch, but like a man relieved to hand over the reins, to say, "Here, carry on." I laid a hand on his knee, feeling that old awkwardness dissolve, replaced by something softer, sturdier: respect. The family drifted in, each member offering congratulations, handshake grips, hugs. My siblings peppered me with questions. What's your first move? How does it feel? Are you scared? And I told them the truth. I was terrified, but more alive than I'd ever been. As midnight approached, we cleared the table together, laughing at the chaos of dishes and napkins. Grandma wandered off to her room, humming an old hymn. Mom collected the plates and glasses, humming along with a smile that flickered between tearful joy and contentment. Dad and I stacked chairs together, working in sync without a word, the silent choreography of two men who'd spent a lifetime side by side without ever truly collaborating. When the last plate was in the dishwasher, Dad turned to me. "You hungry?" he asked, a small grin playing on his lips. I shook my head, full to bursting. "Good." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture both simple and profound. "Get some rest, kid. Tomorrow we start building the future." I nodded, feeling the gravity of that promise. As I walked out into the crisp November night, the stars overhead looked brighter than I remembered. The air was cool, scented with the remains of turkey grease and spiced candles. I paused on the porch, hand on the doorframe, and looked back through the window at Dad's silhouette against the warm golden glow of the living room. He waved and I waved back. In that moment, I knew our story was just beginning. The old wounds would take time to heal, but tonight had shown me that redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about forging ahead, together, with new dreams built on the foundations of the old. And as I headed home, the crunch of leaves underfoot felt like a drumbeat, a call to action. The future waited, and this time, I knew I had what it took to meet it, no longer defined by my father's shadow, but by the light we would create side by side.